The brain, a complex mystery organ that influences everything a person does, thinks, or feels. Life after a brain injury can feel just as mysterious and complex, trying to navigate services, experiencing potential isolation, different functioning, and much more. The rehabilitation process can impact the person as well as their supporters. It's often filled with ups, downs, and everything in between, all while the brain is relearning and making new connections within. Join us as the Brain Injury Association of North Carolina sits down with brain injury advocates to discuss a variety of topics surrounding life after brain injury. The more we understand the different aspects of services and effects of brain injury, the better we can help make connections within our community for individuals living with a brain injury. This is Making Connections. This is Making Connections. Hello there. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to be joined by Angela Lee Tucker to discuss a little bit about her experience with brain injury advocacy and just everything in between. So I'm going to have you started off, Angela. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Wow, thank you, Lauren, for this invitation. It's so good to finally meet you. My name is Angela Lee Tucker, and my husband Rich and I were struck by an 18-wheeler while driving home in New York State from a Yankees baseball game. 6 weeks later, I woke from a coma and was told my husband was killed in the crash. We would have celebrated our first wedding anniversary while I was in the coma. I sustained a traumatic brain injury during that crash.
Wow, that must have been a really a really big experience, really big change. Can you tell me a little bit of what was life like before your injury?
Yes, I had just turned 30 years old. I was the vice president of a wonderful public relations firm in New York City called Hunter Public Relations. My husband and I had recently purchased our first home. I was energetic, outgoing. I loved to dance and sing. I had a talent for talking with complete strangers and making them feel like friends pretty easily, which is one reason why I was so good at my job.
Yeah, that's I can tell that may be something that you still have an experience and have a good talent with after your
Thank
brain
you.
injury.
Thank you.
So what did you experience after your brain injury? What did that process look like? What were your was your experience afterwards?
So my injuries were extensive, so long that I have them listed on my phone. I won't bore you with all the details. I had a left frontal hemorrhage, a right parietal contusion, a bilateral subneurocroid hemorrhage, a bifrontal hemorrhagic contusion, an intraventricular hemorrhage, a left occipital condyle fracture, a C1 vertebrae fracture. That's what Christopher Reeves was paralyzed from, the C1. A left scapula fracture, left ribs fractures 1, 2, and 3. I had third nerve palsy. And the Glasgow Coma Scale is a clinical scale that is used to measure a person's level of consciousness after brain injury. It ranges from 3 to 15. I was a Glasgow Coma Scale of 3, or as my doctor put it, I was least likely to survive. Oh, I also have double vision. So I'm working with a company called the Mind Eye Institute. And in fact, these are my brainwear glasses. They think that with the corrective lenses, special exercises, and time, they believe that they can heal the double vision I've lived with for the last 13 years. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Would you say that is the hardest challenge you've experienced after a brain injury, or what would you say is was your biggest hurdle, and what's your biggest maybe success?
The simple act of reading is very challenging for me now. I used to enjoy reading for pleasure, but now it's difficult to get the words off the page and to land in my brain. That's one of the hardest challenges since the brain injury.
Yeah, I could see that that would be a lot of different sort of, in addition to the vision, reading is such a complex process that you have to, comprehend the words, understand the words, make
Remember where you
connections.
left off on the line. Like I have to read with a ruler to keep the line straight. And then I often write, all of my books are littered with dots and things to remind me where I left off because I can't recall. I don't remember. Sometimes when I go back to a book, I'm like, what was I reading?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so how can you talk about a little bit about how brain injury has changed your life? Maybe, long-term changes, or, you know, um, that rehabilitation process. You mentioned kind of how it might take a long time for the vision, and how has that experience been in terms of, it's not an instant type of change after a brain injury. It takes a lot of work.
Yeah. I've learned lots of compensatory strategies that have helped me live this new life of mine with as much grace and acceptance as possible. I work really hard and sometimes I backslide and then I get pissed off and I work really hard again. It took me a long time to develop good judgment consistently. For example, the night I got on the wrong bus and ended up walking through Fort Tryon Park in Upper Manhattan alone at night. When I mentioned this to my cognitive coach the next day, she was very concerned, but I not so much.
Oh goodness, yeah, that sounds a little bit scary. I know just any sort of public transportation can be so overwhelming, and it's I had to take bus for a long time, and it can be overwhelming. Um,
But when you're with double vision, I couldn't drive immediately after the accident. So public transportation was essential for me. I had to be, but I could get on a bus or a subway would take me anywhere in my Langone, the dry cleaner, the grocery store, everywhere I needed was a public bus or a subway stop away. Very confusing. Sometimes I get lost, but um, that was really critical in the early days of my recovery.
yeah, yeah. And so would you say that you have a particular hobby, talent, or skill that you are really proud of?
I'm really good at bringing people together. And we have an awesome brain injury support group here in Western North Carolina that I call my tribe. We have not come together in person since March of 2020, and the separation has been very difficult. But thank God, my mentor from the Brain Injury Advisory Council, Carol Starr, helped me figure out how to get our support group to meet virtually using Zoom. We now meet the first and third Wednesdays at 4 o'clock, often the highlight of my week. Not everyone is able to attend for difficulties with technology or being on screens, and I feel the day of seeing them in person again is just around the corner.
Yeah, I think that too, and we saw that a lot with many of our support groups. I did just have a little extra question. Uh, what impact do you find that support groups has? What is the benefit of support group? Maybe if there's someone out there that's like, oh, like, yeah, that sounds a little, I don't
Mm,
know, if they're on the fence, what
mm.
could you say to those people?
Oh my gosh, folks, the state of North Carolina has an incredible network of support groups. Incredible, like so many. How many groups are there, Lauren, in the state? Lauren?
It depends, because I think there was about 30,
Yeah, like
and it
30.
fluctuates. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of support groups in whatever corner of the state you're in, it's likely covered and there's at least a virtual element. So what would I say to you? Um, This is an opportunity to speak with people who understand firsthand your experience. When you've seen one brain injury, as my mentor Karen Keating always says, you've seen one brain injury. No two are the same. But somehow being in, right now it's a Zoom room in a virtual screen with 10 or 20 others, everyone has come to that room with a different why they got the brain injury, but we all have resources and ideas and suggestions and support. Man, and as I said, I call them my tribe. They're my family. Since I moved to North Carolina in 2017, and one of the first days I arrived, Karen Keating drove to my apartment and picked me up and drove me to my first group. And it's an incredible way of staying connected, understanding myself, hearing other people experience what I've experienced. And the thing about brain injury is that it's incredibly isolating, incredibly isolating. It's a very lonely place to be, but we don't have to be alone when we can find a support group. And maybe you don't even share anything. That's perfectly fine. If you don't feel like opening your mouth the first few times, that's absolutely fine. But there is a family waiting for you to join somewhere in your part of North Carolina.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea. And I think that's one thing that the virtual component, we didn't have any virtual support groups before, 2020. And, now it's like you could be in anywhere in North Carolina and access a support group. So
In fact, our Western North Carolina group had a member, Chris Baker, an incredibly talented photographer. And his healing journey brought him out west. I'm not entirely sure, Colorado, but because we're virtual now, Chris is still in our tribe. And I'm so eager and waiting for the day when we can return in person. And we're talking about how to creatively make sure the virtual element is still accessible for those across the country and those of us who just aren't able to get in our vehicles and drive there. Who wants to put on clothes all that you can have on your PJ pants and be in the Zoom? And that would be totally appropriate and fine. But I really encourage you to just reach out. The most challenging part is reaching out and listen. Dude, if you're listening, if you're watching us right now and you just need a friend, connect with Lauren afterwards, and I'll try to get your email address or maybe phone number. And I'm happy to be that voice of support for you as you find your tribe. I hope I didn't overdo myself.
No, I think that's so perfect. And I like the idea of a tribe because you have people behind you. You're not alone in this. Like you
Yeah.
said, it can be so isolating. I think one of the hardest parts is that first step. Because I think some people are like, no, I don't need help. Like, I'm good. Like, that idea of like,
Yeah.
if you're reaching out, that
Mhm.
means you're like either
A
not whole.
vulnerability. Mhm.
Yes, that
Mhm.
vulnerability. And it's really like, I like to think of these more as more like kind of social groups, like, like
Yeah.
you said,
Yeah.
looking at resources, talking with
Yeah.
people that just maybe get a part of you
Yeah.
that some people can't.
And I think you touched on an important point, which is acceptance. Everyone who sustains a brain injury is on a different spectrum of acceptance. And whew, for the first few years, uh, life changed entirely. Um, so brain injury changed my life in every way. I was, um, I would get lost more easily. I'd sleep more. Um, but it took a long time to learn to love this new self of mine. And whenever we're challenged with understanding ourselves or accepting ourselves, When we're in a tribe, others are experiencing the exact same thing, and we can be there for each other.
Absolutely. And that kind of touches on one of the questions that I had thought about is, would you say that your experience with brain injury defines you in some way? I feel like that kind of ties in a little bit with the acceptance. Where do you find yourself on that journey?
Hmm. It does not define me, but it has certainly given me a new purpose in life.
And so have you learned anything new about yourself since experiencing the brain injury?
Oh my gosh, how much time do you have? I met a young man named John Carlo at NYU Langone Cancer Center who told me God gives us these tests to strengthen our testimonies. I've learned how resilient I am, and it gives a new meaning to the phrase survivor.
Yeah, I think that can be one of the more challenging aspects is that building up resilience after a brain injury. I think I find a lot of people, are told what they can't do right
Mm.
after an injury. And I think that can be really challenging.
Don't believe the lie, folks out there. I was told in New York State and in North Carolina immediately after my injury that you will experience your maximum recovery within 1 year. Baloney! Baloney! The enormous gains I made in my memory and my attention and my overall energy level since 12 years ago is remarkable. So don't believe the lie, folks, that your maximum healing is going to occur in the first year, because that's just the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, and that's why, I want more people to get that message because I think that all that really does is diminish hope. And if you don't have the hope, then there's not anything to, it's harder to kind of work towards those goals. It's harder to connect to that resilience factor. And I think that, then leads itself to isolation, to, deterioration for some individuals. And
Yeah,
so that
yeah.
then further connects to the idea of connecting to support groups, connecting to resources.
And listen, there are going to be times when you gains and slides, and every brain injury recovery is different and unique. Mine, I'd make 2 steps forward and take 2 steps back. I was just yesterday, I was in a support group, a virtual support group, and a woman was pretty frustrated and expressing, man, I'm doing the same PT exercises I did 2 years ago. And I commended her, like, wow, that's resilience. That's like the frustration that she must be pushing through to do the physical therapy exercises she did 2 years ago, and that served her then, she had to return to because of new complications or challenges. So that's part of the the journey, is how how tolerant we can be to change, and how hard we can push ourselves. And at the time that we're finding it challenging to push ourselves, find a tribe, a support group that can help encourage you.
Yeah, I think that's the long-term kind of challenges I think can be really difficult, just because I feel like, as a normal, as your body ages, et cetera,
Careful, normal is a dirty word.
that's true. But I meant more in terms of like, you know, our body changes just generally as
Because we're
people,
aging.
yeah,
That's
as
a factor.
exactly, as time goes on, and then, I find that our bodies compensate, they try and adapt to, those changes, and then sometimes those are not the healthiest for the other parts of the body. So but I'm glad, that person that, did kept up with PT even for that long.
Yeah,
I know that can
yeah.
be hard just to continue. So I feel like that, yeah, that's another type of resilience, is being able to, participate in different therapies for so long. That can be really because
You know,
did you
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no, you're good.
when I had no business of living in New York City after the accident. I couldn't live independently. So I had to move to North Carolina. My daddy lives in Hendersonville. Love you, daddy. And my bonus mom was a really talented, respected nurse practitioner in the area. And I call her Mama Wall. Her name is Mary Wall. Mama Wall said, Angela, your full-time job is healing. I went from being the vice president of a public relations firm in Manhattan, managing a team of talented executives, to sleeping a lot, to sitting in one chair in their living room hours. But when she gave me that advice, your full-time job is now healing, that allowed me to accept the conditions, accept the situation, not be so hard on myself, let go a little bit of my own expectations. And that's when true healing could unfold, by taking the pressure off myself.
I think that's a really yeah, I mean, you said that and it just like hit me deep because I hear that pressure, that weight, that heaviness of expectations put on a lot of people living with brain injury. I should be
Mhm,
here or connecting,
mhm,
their
mhm,
friends are
mhm.
moving and they're like at different stage levels.
And keep in mind, those closest to us, those who love us and who have the best intentions, can sometimes be the ones that hurt us the most. If we don't feel understood by our parents, by our siblings, there are members of my family in other states that really wonder, because I look amazing. I look even better than probably I did before the crash. Um, so because it's an invisible injury, you can't see my deficits. You can't see the memory loss, the neurofatigue that I really struggle with. I have to manage with a daily nap. So because you can't see the deficits, and it's an invisible injury, they try to treat us as they knew us. They try to, you know, and they have the best intentions, but it's kind of up to us to educate and inform and teach those that love us, and beyond, those in our friend circle. It's that becomes our responsibility, that if we feel we're not being understood or ignored, or symptoms are being denied, we can stop the bus and say, listen, I just want to remind you, I was in a traumatic car crash several years ago, and I have a traumatic brain injury as a result. So you're speaking pretty quickly. There are a lot of lights and a lot of sound. There's two conversations happening at once. I can't process that much information. So I'd really appreciate if you would make these accommodations. And sometimes those closest to us are the ones that would most benefit from the lesson, because they have the best intentions. But it's up to us to help school people around us.
Yeah, I think that component of self-advocacy, we think of advocacy in a lot of different components. Some of it's like legislative, looking at policy, but a lot of times it's more requesting adjustments, identifying what we need, and being able to communicate that need.
And sometimes that's hard because you might not know what you need. Yeah, it's sometimes pretty challenging, because if you're, depending on how long you've been experiencing this, you might not know that the multiple lights or the multiple conversation, you might not know that that is overstimulating for the brain, and that now I'm not able to filter out the things that I once was able to. So I have to be in a quieter space. I have to be in a darker space. So if you don't know what accommodations you need, then try to find an advocate. And the Brain Injury Association of North Carolina is full of them. My favorite, the woman who I credit, aside from my daddy moving here, Karen Keating. She brought me to Washington, D.C. for my first time and showed me the power of advocating and speaking up for my own needs. So if you can't find your, if you can't understand or articulate, being able to find an advocate and taking a look at the Brain Injury Association of North Carolina first, a good place to start. But I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think, trying to assess what your own needs are, but it can be really hard. Some people, every person has some sort of, challenge that maybe isn't um, something that they are aware of, or,
Right.
things like that. So it's hard, and that's common after brain injury too, like the self-awareness piece. But I would argue that every individual has trouble with self-awareness.
For example, in the beginning of my journey, and still to this day, neurofatigue is quite challenging. I manage it with a daytime nap. I'm going to be hopping into my nap time recliner after this conversation. But I wasn't always aware when neurofatigue was kicking. And neurofatigue is when the brain can't filter out multiple stimuli. And so if I yawned, I began to understand that that was my indication that I needed to rest or assume. So I would tell people around me. And by the way, if you see me yawn, start steering me home. I need to rest. And I wouldn't always know that I was yawning. And so others around, so I relied a little bit on feedback from others to know that my energy levels were low.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good kind of technique that you've developed. Again, kind of relying on others as well as, once you've identified it in yourself. I know that fatigue is something that a lot of people struggle with, and they end up going too far, and then it, sometimes takes days to recover
Mhm.
really from that. And are there any other, you mentioned, taking naps, reducing the extra stimulation, lights, noise, etc. Are there any other tools or tricks that you've added to your routines to kind of help you thrive?
Ooh, I have lots of tricks. And there are three that I use. I lovingly call my phone my external brain because when I can't remember, this thing always can. And so I'll share three of my favorite tricks that I use for my phone. Um, Whenever I add someone to my phone, and let's see how many folks are currently in my phone, just out of curiosity. Let's just see. Lauren, I think I recently added you. 1,839 contacts in my phone. But I promise you, all of them have detailed notes. If you entered into my phone after the brain injury, and the notes are pretty concise, where I met you, when, and maybe what we discussed. And now that I'm not working in an office, I set alarms all day long. It's not a 9 to 5 anymore. So I need an audio reminder of what to do and when to do it. So for example, here are the alarms that I have set for today. There's an alarm for this conversation in there somewhere. When to pray, when to take naps, vitamins. So setting alarms, I set an alarm every Wednesday for my support group because I forget. And then when my alarm goes off, I'll text a few members of my tribe to remind them, hey, you guys, 4 o'clock, hope to see you. So that's been very, very helpful for myself. And the third thing is I have countless reminders in my iPhone. Um, Everyone has a different sort of calendar. My calendar reminds me when to wash my bed linens, when to water my plants. So it helps me sort of get from point A to point B. As you'd mentioned, the naps is really important for me. So I force this 40-year-old woman to take a daily nap after lunch. And sometimes this inner child is kicking and screaming, and I may not always fall asleep. but I am sure to wear a sleep mask, which recharges my brain in some way.
Yeah, I think that not people can recognize there's like lots of different types of rest. What it's really just reducing stimulation, if you're even if you're not taking a full on, nap type thing, but your brain just needs that time to just sort of recharge, just
Mhm.
sort of take in a little bit less so that you can take in more later versus again kind of hitting that wall and then paying for it through like either grogginess or
Yeah.
some people have like slowed speech if they've hit that wall. Did you experience any sort of that kind of cognitive wall where you're just like
Oh,
can't get
yeah.
anything done?
Oh, yeah. You know, in my earlier days when I was living in New York City, I was going to outpatient physical therapy, vestibular therapy, cognitive remediation. I think there was occupational therapy. There was a fifth one. So it was, you know, full-time job. I was in, I was at the um, outpatient therapy center most days of the week. And I'd hit those walls quite often because it's new learning and new information and new friends and conversations. Like, oh, I sometimes felt like I was in the army, like I was trying to scale a brick wall, and it was felt insurmountable at times. But that's when you, that's when I kept pushing forward and um, kept moving forward.
Yeah, I know you mentioned one of the challenging things is like you can't see fatigue, like other than maybe a yawn or something like that, like the invisibility of the brain injury and challenges afterwards, I think can be, you likened it to a physical challenge, which, I wish more people did. Those kind of, almost like, if you have a physical challenge and you need some sort of ramp, there, there's strategies, tools,
Yeah,
tricks that we
yeah,
talked about. They're kind of cognitive ramps or thinking ramps or
yeah,
communication
yeah,
ramps, like
yeah.
thinking of it more in a acceptable,
That's a good
community acceptable
analogy.
way.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good analogy.
Yeah, no, I always try because yeah, I wish that more people thought about like it like that because I agree that some people, they have a hard time accepting, oh, well, why do you need a quiet room? I can hear you just fine. That kind of like empathy, that kind of processing is a little bit tricky.
Those folks, we gotta be teachers. We gotta educate.
Yeah,
They have
exactly.
the best intentions. They don't mean to be. Um, I was going to use a bad word that's probably going to be buzz us. They don't mean to be rude. Um, they don't mean to be that person.
Hmm.
Sometimes they do. So it's just a lack of education and understanding, and that's when we can be empowered to teach them, to show them.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful tool to have in someone's arsenal, or like you mentioned, finding an advocate to help you communicate that need. Because like you said, I mean, sometimes it's hard with family. You have a lot of background, you have a lot of experiences that kind of led up to this. You guys have both potentially gone through this experience, this
Right.
trauma.
That's the thing is
Um,
a brain injury happens to the entire family. Um, my poor goodness gracious, my family. My mm, I had lost my little sister in a car accident a few years before my own. Um, it was when I was coming out of the coma, and coming out of a coma is not like a moment when you wake up and your eyes are alert and for me it was a process of coming in and out. And at one point I was coming out and I remember Dana, and I said to myself, oh my God, I can't let my mother and father bury their only other living child from a car accident. And in that moment, Dana became the inspiration and the motivation to leave the wheelchair, leave the hospital bed. And she and my husband Rich are wonderful angels that I I experience and I connect with all the time when I'm open to it. That I'm sorry, I lost the question. I lost track. Where are we?
That's all right. No, so I mean, we were really just talking about, um, the connection to family and the entire kind of group going through
Yeah,
the experience that, that's why sometimes it can be hard to, make progress because everyone's kind of going through their own,
yeah,
challenges and their own kind of traumatic experiences. And it
yeah.
sounds like you had your own kind of connection kind of through that trauma to individuals that really kind of kept you going and
Yeah.
inspired you in some sort of way.
Yeah. In New York City, there was a support group for caregivers of people with brain injury. And there was a period of time where we were doing caregiver groups in the Western North Carolina area, I think once a month. Um, that's partners, husbands, children, parents, that their loved one had the lives have completely changed. And that those implications, that changes a lot of lives around us. So they need as much support as we do. I don't know if the state of North Carolina has many caregiver support groups, but do they?
So there's not a lot of like specific brain injury support groups. So actually since we were able to take advantage of the virtual capacity, the Brain Injury Association of North Carolina started a statewide virtual group that meets once a month. There is a caregivers group in the
Oh,
Charlotte area
oh, that's good.
that's meeting in virtually right now, I think, but I'm not sure now that things are opening up, called the Lobist group.
Oh,
And then there are a lot of just like generic, just general caregiver groups that are available in pretty much every county through the
oh,
Department of Areas of on Aging, but it also works with people with it all helps people with disabilities.
oh, lovely.
So I always recommend, any sort of group that might connect with people because, especially in those rural counties, anything is better than
Resource. Yes, thank
nothing.
you. Yeah, that's a meaningful resource.
Hmm. Yeah. And so, we talked I'll finish up very quickly, but I just have two more questions. One is kind of, you mentioned, connecting with a group for your eyes and your vision. And what has that been like kind of seeking out different therapies to
Mm.
better your experiences? Because I know that can be really challenging for people to be able to be like, okay, I have this. What do
Mm.
I do now?
Yeah, I wish you were. My goodness, that's a great question. I wish you were at when on Tuesday of this week. A few of us were invited to the crisis intervention training program at the Blue Ridge Community College, their law enforcement group, and we had an great speakers: Eric Davis, Jonathan Bassetti, and John Muschetti, and they were talking about John is actually a veteran, and veterans have access to a lot more um, cutting edge therapies than necessarily civilians per se. But we were talking about identifying what are therapies that are available. And when you're in a support group, you get a lot of new ideas because a lot of people are trying new things. In fact, my journey at the Mind Eye Institute, it's actually in Northbrook, Illinois. I mentioned it during a support group, and another gentleman started to try it out, and it's working for him too. Um, so it might be something else that this veteran friend of ours might try out. So it's bouncing ideas off of one another, and I've done neurofeedback, which was very beneficial in New York City. I haven't found as many resources in the immediate area. And the other thing is the expense of this stuff, right? Insurance doesn't cover it all. So it's finding a delicate balance between balancing your funds, the expenses of it, and then just being open to because discoveries are being made all the time. New solutions are being found all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great message, and I think one that, people can hold on to. I think even within the past few years, maybe just even 5 years here in North Carolina, just there's been a service kind of change and recognition of brain injury in general. And I think, my hope is that we'll see a lot more services and resources expanding with specific brain injury knowledge, to be able to help more people throughout the state of North Carolina. That's always my goal. And so, kind of my last question, and maybe some big kind of takeaways you would want people that are listening, but what do you want providers to know about either, your personal experience, or, how can they what can they take away from this?
Mm. First and foremost, it's very important to work with a counselor who understands brain injury. I have a wonderful cognitive coach who I meet with a few hours a week, and an awesome personal counselor an hour every other week. I think that it's important for providers to really listen to their patients. The symptoms and deficits that come along with this invisible disability of brain injury can be easily misunderstood and misdiagnosed.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot in terms of, because we talked about the invisibility of it, people just might attribute it to something else. And one thing that I find is that a lot of people with brain injury can internalize some of those challenges if they're not able to communicate or identify those challenges related to brain injury. They
Mhm.
might internalize it as like, I'm stupid or I'm a failure, and, how heavy that can feel in moving forward. So I think it's important for providers to be able to stop that, then those negative
Amen.
conversations in the
Amen.
head, and really move it towards positivity.
Well put.
Is
I
there so
have, I have a question for you, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
what's up?
You've been interviewing me. Lauren, what brings you to the world of brain injury? Do you know someone personally with brain injury, or what brought you to our support?
Yeah, it's been a long road. I've always been, interested in working with people with disabilities. My great grandfather had a stroke,
Mm,
and I always knew him. I was like 2 years old at the time, so I always knew him as someone that was, paralyzed on one side,
yeah.
wasn't able to speak. You had to, speak on one side of his, on the one side. Um, and I would just always was really connected to him. Even as a child, I, would go and I would read to him, and,
No.
and he'd talk, and I'd, be like, yeah, yeah, even though you couldn't really understand it. So I think it was just always something within me that, like, that was him, and that was okay. You can still connect and you can still make relationships, even if it's not necessarily the traditional one. And so I think that, as I was going through my, schooling and doing different, work with people with autism and other types of challenges, I still had a love of, just working with people that maybe are seen as different from society. But for me, it's just, okay, how can we adjust, and, let's still have a relationship in that sort of way. So,
Wow.
so then, I was able to work with people in the hospital setting, kind of that have experienced brain injury, strokes, cancer, and
Yeah.
I did some companion care for a while for people with cognitive difficulties, um, and yeah, so I just, and then from there just kind of kept working with individuals with brain injury. So it was kind of that one little spark, and then now, it's become a passion of advocacy and education for me.
So we kind of get to thank your great granddaddy for bringing you to this world. What's his
My
name?
pappy.
Oh,
My
Pappy.
Pappy
Thank,
was what I called him, but
thank
yeah,
you, Pappy.
Clarence. Yeah, Clarence
Thank you,
Harsh.
Pappy.
Yeah, so it's something that I appreciate, and I'm always thankful to connect with advocates like yourself in all types of fashions. And I hope that I'm just so thankful for our conversation today, because I think we
Thank
touched
you.
on a lot of really important things that I hope that someone, just one person, hears and really connects with, because I there was so much, really. And
Thank
so
you.
I'll give you kind of the final words, if you'd like, if there's anything we
Please.
didn't talk about, or just kind of how you want to finish us off.
Uh, I think Pappy was a good way to end the conversation.
Sounds good. Well, thank you. Thank you to Pappy and everyone out there that has, really just impacted individuals with brain injury. And so thank you so much, Angela. I really appreciate it. I look forward to, future collaborations and connections for
Thank
the
you.
brain injury community.
And I look forward to the tribes out there in the state growing and being even more supportive. And I'm so grateful for the work you do. You
Yes,
have a
yes.
fabulous day, my dear.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.